You gotta wonder, kind of, don't you? You spend years traveling with Jesus. Literally, years. You walk endless miles till your arches go flat and your feet are so calloused that you don't even need sandals anymore. And you spend countless hours at the feet of Jesus listening to his lessons and his parables and his insights into Scripture. And you even just hear the everyday chit-chat from Jesus. And yet, the first time that a Samaritan village turns up its nose at having Jesus pay them a visit, what do you do? If you're James and John, you ask for permission to call in an airstrike on the village. I mean, that's what it says, basically, right there. Luke 9:54, right? Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? They sound a little bit eager. And they also make it sound like this kind of casual favor. Hey, Jesus, bro, that Samaritan village down the road, they don't want to hear from you, so do you want us to set their women and children on fire for you, or do you want to handle it? How do you want to do this? And Jesus, we're told, looks up to the sky, and then he looks at the Zebedee boys, and he says, what I want is for you to have a clue about what I've been saying all along here. What in everything I have ever said in your presence would make you think that that was an okay thing to do? Well, technically, Luke just says that Jesus rebuked them, but I like to think that it sounded something like that. Except it was in Aramaic. But time was running out for Jesus. The clock was ticking. And Jesus had bigger things to focus on than whether his disciples understood his teachings. So here he was. He was faced with this kind of insane, Dr. Strangelove request from two of his innermost disciples. Hey, do you want us to burn the village for you? Now, to be fair, there was plenty of bad blood between the Samaritans and the rest of the people of Israel, and that had been going on for like 700 years by this time. And just to kind of take a peek down the rabbit hole, we're not going to go in, but just to take a look at it, I can tell you that the hostility between the Samaritans and everybody else started sometime during the Assyrian invasion. Because the Samaritans were not deported, whereas many Judeans and others were. And that led to bad feelings about who was and who was not toadying up to the Assyrian adversaries and who was just rolling over and who wasn't. And then you add to this the Samaritan insistence that their temple, which happened to be on their mountain, Mount Gerizim, they insisted that that was the only place on earth where you could have a temple to worship God. And mainline Judaism insisted instead that Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, which happened to be in their territory, was the only place where you could have a temple. And you can see they have this kind of Crips and Bloods thing going on. Nobody respected anybody. At one point, the Israelites destroyed the temple of the Samaritans. At another point in Jesus' lifetime, a group of Samaritans broke into the temple in Jerusalem and they spread animal bones all over the place to make it unclean. That's the sort of thing that was going on. On a a side note, that's what made the parable of the Good Samaritan such a powerful parable, because there the Samaritan was the good guy. But still, when you do a careful reading of the gospel, it does not reveal anywhere where Jesus said, love your neighbor unless they happen to be Samaritans. Not there. So you can understand why Jesus would have felt the need to stomp on the idea of destroying a Samaritan town just for the sin of not welcoming him. Here's a sad truth. And I think it's an even sadder commentary on humanity. Because that kind of thinking continues to surface today. Sometimes it's more subtle, but it's there. I think that maybe there is deep down in human nature something that likes feeling superior. There's certainly something within us that promotes the insidious notion that if somebody is different from us, that means obviously they're not as good as us. I remember my linguistics professor 100 years ago telling us that every language basically has a term that means people, meaning us people. And then a term for everybody else, meaning, those others that aren't like us. And I think it's part of our DNA. It's part of what happened to humanity when it turned away from God. And as Christians, it's our call to struggle against that. It's our struggle to admit it and to recognize it and to fight it. Because let's face it, hatred and intolerance and bigotry have probably been the most influential engines in history in the last umpteen thousand years. Think of every event in history that at its core has hatred, bigotry, whatever, fighting. You get a list that you can't even finish. And it doesn't have to be over anything particular. Nowadays it's Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, Packer, Viking fan, It's all sorts of things. But we find a way to draw a line here and say, this is my side and this is the wrong side. And nothing can fuel that conviction like the idea that we come from a religiously superior position. Because if you can convince yourself that God is on your side, that you're doing what God wills, then you can convince yourself of just about anything. We have seen that way too many times in the world. We certainly can't say we've outgrown it. On a less violent scale, we're kind of embroiled in that now in the United Methodist Church. Which I think is why this particular gospel caught my attention this week. I mean, if the disciples themselves, who had the benefit of being directly exposed to Jesus for years, can still fall into the trap of religious zealotry, maybe you can kind of understand how we do that too. Here's a funny thing. We can look back at the animosity between Samaritans and Jews and immediately to see how pointless that was. We can look back at the internecine warfare that happened between Roman Catholics and Protestants. You look back at the Reformation, as one of my professors said once, you look back at the Reformation, and it was a time when Catholics were freely slaughtering Protestants, and Protestants were happily slaughtering Catholics, and everybody was slaughtering Anabaptists because they were pacifists. All in the name of God. We can look back at that and we can see how shamefully pointless that was. And we can look at conflicts between Christians and Muslims and Hindus and Sunni and Sufi Muslims and Serbs and Croatian. We can look at anything and say, just snap out of it. That's stupid. Why are you acting that way? But then if it comes to one thing that we happen to have some prejudice about, it's suddenly very hard to see that same pointlessness. It takes a good deal of discernment and introspection to see it. Because where there's conflict, there should be conversation. Where there is anger, there should be grace. And where there is hostility, there should be holiness. But we struggle. When you think about it, of all the people in the world, Christians should know best how to have a civil conversation. Even if it's over an issue as prickly as changing the United Methodist discipline to reflect a complete acceptance of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters in our community. I mean, we come from teachings that talk about love and acceptance and not casting the first stone and, pulling the mote out of our own eye before we try to get the speck out of our neighbor's eye. All of that stuff. Come from there, then how can we write or stand in public forums and still denigrate one another? How can we say your opinion is wrong and it doesn't count? How can we as Christians mock or disparage or even threaten one another over an issue like this? The simple answer is we can't. Not if we consider ourselves to be following in the footsteps and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Don't get me wrong. I am not suggesting or calling for uniformity of thought. I don't think everybody has to think the same way. But I do think that we have to be uniformly civil with one another, and we have to mutually respect one another in the United Methodist community as we work through these changes. At annual conference 2 weeks ago, during the plenary sessions and after and in between and all of that, I heard some very harrowing stories of prejudice. During discussion on the floor, sometimes it got to be pretty hostile, considering the environment. And we have to learn to get past that if we want to call ourselves Christian. And I had the thought this week, and I don't think I'm alone, but I had the thought that if we can figure out how to address this particular issue within the United Methodist Church, we can figure out how to address it without either side calling for holy fire to consume the other side. If we can stop the invective, and that means if we can police ourselves. This is the hard part. Let's not police somebody else, what they're saying. Let's just watch what we're saying. So that we are not falling away from what Jesus would want us to do and say. If we can do that as a community and as a church, as a United Methodist denomination, then maybe we can model for the rest of society how to handle conflict. Wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't it be nice to wake up some morning and look at Facebook and see a discussion about some political issue that wasn't all flames and name-calling? Wouldn't it be nice to turn on the news and to hear politicians talking about, actual ideas instead of trying to score points against one another? Wouldn't it be nice to see people interacting as though they cared about each other? And if we can do that, then model that for the rest of society, maybe we can help make that happen. It's time for consensus building. Excuse the cliche, it's time for bridge building. It's time for hope. It's time for doing things the way Jesus would want them to be done, which is to be done with grace and love and charity towards all, and hatred for no one. One of my favorite quotes, and I think I put it on Facebook this past week, I periodically throw it out there, but one of my favorite historical quotes is from a Lutheran pastor named Martin Niemöller. He was a guy, his past was checkered, let's say, because initially in his career he supported the Nazi party. But then as he saw what they became, or maybe as he saw what they always were, he started to speak against them. And he ended up being thrown into prison. He was imprisoned in the camps at Sachsenhausen and Dachau from 1938 to 1945. He was liberated. If anybody ever had an excuse to hate somebody else, probably him. And yet, looking back, he said, "It took me a long time to realize that not only did God not hate my enemies, he didn't even hate his enemies." And that dovetails nicely with something that one of our speakers said during Bible study annual conference. His name is Peter Miano, and you can look it up online. The studies are on YouTube. And I'm going to paraphrase what he said because I didn't write it down. But he said, if your interpretation of the Bible supports oppressing or discriminating against another human being, then your interpretation is flawed. So how are we interpreting the Bible today? In our churches, in our lives,